In his second team-up with Gus Van Sant, Matt Damon plays Steve Butler, a salesman for Global, a natural gas company that specializes in fracking. A rising star in his field, Steve travels to the small town of McKinley to do what he does best: convince farmers to sell their mineral rights leases and grant their drilling rights to a large corporation. Steve, who is easy on the eyes and looks like regular folk, quickly charms the people in the town and gets the first few contracts signed up and ready to go. Everything goes according to plan, as it always does with Steve, and this time he's even developing a crush on a local teacher, Alice, played by the often underrated Rosemary DeWitt.
Well, I don't know what your problem is. It's my birthday.
But then comes a town hall meeting that changes everything. In it, a corrupt supervisor named Jerry Richards takes time to explain why Global is going to, quote, save their town from the economic hardships they've been experiencing. He hypes up the community, who slowly but surely seems to be well on its way to accept Global's offer. Cue Frank Yates, an elderly local high school science teacher who used to be a successful engineer. First, Frank asks,
"How do they get the gas?"
Jerry goes on to explain, but Frank already knows the answer. In fact, he even interrupts Jerry's explanation by saying,
It's called fracking.
Frank then goes on to say that things aren't quite as simple as they seem, and that in fact there are unpleasant consequences to the fracking process.
This thing here, it may not be the saving grace that you all want it to be.
At this point, Steve, who's been standing to the side, intervenes in an attempt to discredit Frank and reassure the community. And so begins a compelling bout between two generations, two ideologies, two very different Americas. One wants freedom, the other wants to use the idea of freedom in the name of capitalistic greed. Steve goes into this tete-a-tete thinking he's talking to just another old man who lives in an old town, perhaps without much education and that can be easily swayed with prefabricated words and a light touch. But Frank knows this battle. Quite well, in fact. He fought it before. So when Steve says that he's not the guy with all the answers, Frank aptly replies,
Oh, well then you'd be the perfect guy for them to send here to deny everything.
This leads Steve to become defensive, using history as his shield, saying that corporations have been fracking in America for over 50 years. This, argues Steve, is not a new issue, and it's not a new technology. Which prompts Frank to point out,
But Global is being sued, isn't that true, Steve?
And then Van Sant cuts to a very significant shot. More precisely, this shot. It's a close-up of Steve framed against the American flag, half of his face hiding in the dark. Note that we don't even see his left eye. What we have, now more clearly than ever, is a battle not between two men, but between corporate America and rural America. One is alone and doing his dirty business in the shadows, half of it at least, while the other attempts to retain its dignity while fighting for what's best, not for the individual, but for the community.
These people and I came here to say we strongly believe this is not in the best interests of this town.
It's certainly not a coincidence that even when there's a close-up of Frank, we can still see people around him, because he's not alone, and we can see him clearly because he has nothing to hide. Steve, realizing the implications of the position he's being put in, gets imbued by patriotism and does what so many others do in this position. He becomes arrogant and he attacks. And when that doesn't work, Steve goes to war.
I'd just like everybody to keep something in mind here. There's no such thing as a neutral position here. If you are against this, you are for coal and oil. Period.
Eventually, democracy wins, at least temporarily, as Frank proposes that the town vote on this issue in 3 weeks' time. For Steve, who thought he'd simply come in and conquer this town, the vote's a huge blow. It's also a decisive moment not only for that job but in his life. Underestimating Frank leads Steve down a path of self-reflection and self-evaluation, ultimately making him realize that the game, meaning capitalism in America, has been rigged from the start. The sequence, and what happens within this shot in particular, also showcases what Van Sant does so well and so often, understanding the moment and framing it within the big picture in the simplest way possible. Through relatively straightforward yet expressive storytelling, Van Sant allows us to understand that what we're witnessing is a microcosm of what's been happening in America for a long time. Not just the 50 years Steve mentions, but the 50 before that, and the 50 before those as well. Subtle as it may be, it's an indictment of a culture that so often promotes capitalistic thirst at the cost of the little guy.
We both know that money could lead very often to bad decisions.
Promised Land is the type of film Hollywood makes less and less as the years go by. Almost a decade later, though, it still feels relevant, especially as we start reckoning with what the roaring 2020s might bring. And to that point, the shot of Steve framed against the American flag with an obfuscated face, the shot symbolizing what America wants to be and how, continues to carry the power of prescience. It tells us that education and a sense of community are perhaps the most needed of gifts, that there is strength in numbers, and that when informed, voting is the greatest tool at the disposal of a democracy.